everyone. I'm Eliza Bournet, and I'm the editor of the Oxford American magazine. Welcome to Southwards. We kicked off this series last month with a visit from Sarah Broom, and I know all of you who are here who have read Sarah's memoir, The Yellow House, will be eagerly following news from the National Book Awards tomorrow night, as Sarah is one of 5 finalists in the nonfiction category, so that's very exciting. Tonight we are thrilled to welcome Nate Powell and Van Jensen to Little Rock to discuss their gripping graphic novel, Two Dead. My colleagues and I loved it so much, we excerpted a big chunk of it in our recent fall issue. Even though Two Dead only went on sale today, these two are such rock stars that I've already heard rumors of comic shops selling out of it. Fortunately, we have a big stack here. Two Dead, which is set in Little Rock in 1946, was inspired by a story Van encountered while working as a crime reporter at the Arkansas Democrat-Gazette. He left the paper in 2007 and has gone on to write some of the biggest characters in comics, including The Flash, Superman, Wonder Woman, and James Bond, as well as for the award-winning Pinocchio Vampire Slayer trilogy of graphic novels. In 2016, he was named a U.S. State Department comic book ambassador. A native of western Nebraska, today he lives in Atlanta. Van's collaborator, Nate Powell, is the first cartoonist ever to win the National Book Award, though he may be more familiar to many of you for his work closer to home. Nate was born in Little Rock and grew up playing in punk bands and writing and drawing comics and graphic novels in North Little Rock. His work includes John Lewis's March trilogy, Come Again, Any Empire, Swallow Me Whole, The Silence of Our Friends, and others. His books have been placed on school curriculum in more than 40 states. He lives in Bloomington, Indiana. The idea behind this series is to bring renowned Oxford American contributors to town for readings and onstage conversations with local editors and writers. We couldn't have found a better moderator than Jennings, the OA's senior editor, who is the author of Carry the Rock, Race Football and the Soul of an American City, about the Central High football team 50 years after the '57 crisis, and the editor of Escape Velocity, a Charles Portis miscellany. Jay was an early fan of True Dead and brought Nate and Van's excerpt to the Oxford American. We are all lucky to have access to world-class literary programming like Southwards here in Little Rock, and I have several partners to thank for making it possible. Our presenting sponsor is the UCA College of Fine Arts and Communication, where Nate and Van visited today for a workshop with students. The reading series is presented in partnership with the Central Arkansas Library System's Six Bridges Book Festival. Additional season partners include the Clinton School of Public Service, Arkansas Arts Council, the Department of Arkansas Heritage, and Villa View at SOMA. In addition to planning Southwards and publishing a magazine, the Oxford American creates many other programs, like our popular concert series at South on Main, a writer's fellowship and intern program, and a brand new podcast, Point South. If you appreciate what we do, please consider supporting the Oxford American. You can do that today in the lobby by buying an OA subscription or a copy of the magazine. Our South Carolina music issue goes on sale today, or by making a tax-deductible contribution. Finally, a couple of housekeeping notes. First, this evening's program is being recorded for a segment on a future episode of Point South. The program will end with a Q&A. If you ask a question, you are giving your consent to have your voice appear on our podcast. When it's time for questions, please line up at the microphones in the aisle so we can all hear you. Second, copies of Two Dead and other works from these authors are available for purchase in the lobby, and Nate and Van will be happy to sign them for you. Let's give Nate and Van a warm hometown welcome and let them know how happy we are that they're launching Two Dead in Little Rock.
Thank you all for coming. I want to start by saying a little bit about Two Dead, which the modest authors might feel too embarrassed to say themselves. As Eliza mentioned, this is the book's official publication day, but the pre-publication reviews have already weighed in. In a starred review, Book List said, An intense, gritty, thrilling crime story and a painful rumination on race, rage, and inescapable ghosts. This could be an early contender for the next award season. Kirk has stated that Powell applies a pleasingly realistic look while cartoonish flourishes electrify the page. Jensen weaves a propulsive narrative of intersecting stories and festering wounds that is highly engaging. Publishers Weekly wrote that this crime graphic novel might be made up, but the questions it raises are a real gut punch. The complexity of the book showed itself in how we tried to excerpt it. We first wanted to do 6 or 8 pages, but it was really difficult, if not impossible, to carve out an excerpt of that length that did justice to the context. So we went up to 10 pages, then 12, and then finally we decided, why not give it a full form in the magazine at 16 pages? The minimum we thought we needed to capture the layers and threads that intertwine in this story. Such an involved, collaborative undertaking as these 2 gentlemen produced probably conjures up images of Nate at the drawing board and Van at his keyboard in the same room, inking away and pounding out crisp dialogue while the Klipsch speakers boom Sophie Nun Squad in the background. But actually these 2 saw each other for the first time in 3 years today. But the project has been a long simmering and passion project for both of these artists for a long time. So we'll open it up first. Van, why don't you talk a little bit about the origin of the story, how this story first gripped you?
So, for those who don't know me, I started out as a newspaper reporter right here in Little Rock at the Dem-Gaz. I came out of college in, I guess, '04, and before long I was working as a crime reporter at the newspaper. And so, the job is, reporting on crimes as they happen, going to crime scenes, all of that, but every day I would have to go to the various police departments, and at Little Rock's police department there are these plaques on the walls that commemorate officers who fell in the line of duty. And there was this, one particular plaque as I was sitting and waiting on an interview with someone that I started to read just to pass the time, and it was about an officer who died in line of duty in 1947 on New Year's Day, and I won't say more than that to spoil the ending of the book. But it was one of those moments where I could just see that there was both this great tragedy that had happened, but also that it was very clear that things had been left out of that text and out of that history. And I don't really know why, but it just nagged at me, and I decided to go to the archives of the newspaper and dig through the reporting that had happened at the time, and had kind of seen how this really terrible event had happened that had shaped the department in a big way, but also an event that was so awful that people had really decided not to talk about it, and that it became this forgotten piece of history. And so my reporting on it led to a story in the newspaper, but there were so many factors that were so rich and so compelling. The chief of detectives of the police department at the time was schizophrenic and thought that he was literally battling demons, which of course is very, very compelling, and also just as someone interested in battles of mental health, I thought that was very compelling to write about. But also the city was strictly segregated at the time, both in terms of where people live, but also the African American part of town had a separate police force that was essentially a militia of soldiers who had come home from post-war. You also had these great social changes happening in that era, as well as organized crime having a significant presence in the city. So when you think about all the great trappings of fiction, all of those elements were there, and so I knew that I needed to, keep thinking on it, keep working on it, hopefully at some point figure out how to turn it into a book.
And when did Nate come into it? Nate, you want to answer that?
You bet. Yeah, it was around 2011. So I guess you might have you've been working on it for at least 2 years, I think. And I was about to become, it was a month full of events right before I became a dad for the first time. And I just embarked upon a couple of new projects, and Van wrote at the right time. Was like, oh yeah, I've got this thing in mind. More or less like no pressure at this point, but do you have time to basically do some concept illustrations so that I can take this and start to work it into a script that we can shop around? So I was immediately just really compelled by what you had written and sent me. And I think I came up with 6 illustrations, and then parenthood happened. And then I was like, well, I don't think that's going to come back around. But then we went through a series of permutations of the book in terms of responding to potential interest or changing the format, changing the scope of the story, but basically like the life of Two Dead itself went through so many years of changes and reorganization of its contents and its themes that eventually the book itself also became a reflection of social and political shifts over the decades spent creating the book itself. So I think we started working on it in earnest in 2014, and then again in 2016.
But Van, your history as your acquaintance with Nate Powell, at least by reputation, started out in Little Rock. Is that correct? Or much earlier?
Yeah. So I've always been a big comic book nerd.
You were also like the part-time, additionally the crime reporter, the part-time comic book reviewer for the Dim Gas.
Right. So the features editor asked me, he knew that I read comic books, and so asked me if I would write this column about comics. And so I would go to the 2 comic shops in town at the time, the comic shop, and then I forget what the North Little Rock.
Collector's edition.
Collector's edition, of course. And it was at Collector's edition that the owner handed me a copy of Nate's earliest, I guess, formal graphic novella, a non, sort of like DIY comic. It Disappears, and told me that Nate was local, and then I wrote about Nate for the column in the newspaper, and was a huge fan for years, and reached out to him for an interview and didn't hear back way back in the day.
I actually just found out a few minutes ago that I forgot to write him back in 2007.
I've been holding on to that fan for a long time. I'd still like to interview you.
We're all letting go of our demons tonight.
When you first, a little bit later, we're going to have them go through a scene that shows the collaborative process, and they'll take you through how a script becomes a piece of art and how they change as it develops. But I also wanted to ask you, it's interesting that you converge in Little Rock, and I've always contended that Little Rock is the most fascinating place that I've lived, in this story that I had never heard really before I picked up the graphic novel. Has so many threads and so many different social strata, social problems, issues in Little Rock, that I wonder if you could speak to some of the how you wanted to develop the complex layers of this story. And I know the project started out in a different form, and how that form morphed to become what it is right now.
For me, you know, I mean, I think I've grown as a writer over, so this is 10 years that we're talking about, so when I first started the book, I'm not going to say that I was the writer that I hope that I'm a better writer today than I was then. But I've always, in all of my writing, going back to nonfiction, I've always tried to write in a way that is accessible and relatable and down to earth, but also even writing for the newspaper, I was interested in getting into big questions and thematic issues and digging below the surface, I guess. And that's both in bringing particular detail, like real gritty, granular detail into the storytelling. I mean, I remember, for me, Little Rock is like this kind of haunted city, both because of, I mean, mainly because what I did was go to crime scenes and a lot of murder scenes. So it was, you know, literally dealing with death and with ghosts. And so bringing that feel into it, but, you know, even as a crime reporter, I would always, like, there was a woman that I interviewed who a car had run into her house one morning. And I remember going and finding her, and she was sitting outside and still had her robe on, and, you know, I'd go over there with my notebook and ask her, like, so, you know, it was your house? And she says, yeah. And I said, where were you when the guy crashed in the house? She said, I was in the kitchen. I said, okay. What were you doing in the kitchen? I was making breakfast. Oh, okay. So, what were you making for breakfast? Well, I was baking. Okay. What were you baking? I was baking muffins, okay? Okay. What kind of muffins? Blueberry muffins, okay? Blueberry muffins. Leave me alone. A guy just drove his car into my house. And so, you know, I tell that story to be funny, of course. But also, I'm a big believer that by being very particular and specific, you ground a reader in a place and in a moment. And, you know, it is a little thing, but when you look and you read the newspaper and you see that this woman was baking blueberry muffins in her kitchen at the moment that a car crashed into her house, you smell blueberry muffins. You know, your brain is doing that work, and you empathize with that woman even more. So that was the intent of the research, and also just the intent of being respectful to the real people who lived through tragedy, of course.
And those details make it into the final art in some cases. What's the interplay there between those details and what appears on the page finally?
Generally speaking, I feel like my relationship to most scripts has to do with recognizing two different kinds of lines to read in between the lines of the script, or looking for absent information. So while doing my duty to follow through with details and concrete information that might be within a description or within some dialogue, I'm also sort of scanning the scene with, in this case, Van's sense of self in mind, trying to peruse what may be around, and at the same time recognizing, particularly something that's set historically, where information is absent from a script, either kind of sets me free to kind of like to do my own thing, which usually leans more towards very intuitive, highly subjective, personal kind of narratives, and even in historical nonfiction comics I've done, there's always room to sort of spread those wings, and that's actually what brings the historical part of the narrative to life. And that was very easy to do with this book, particularly because we have made the choice to step away from the strict limitations of historicity within this book, but then also keeping an eye out for details or information that might be absent in between the lines of the script, meaning either it's my job to flesh out those details, to inquire for more information or get clarification. But a lot of times that's the most fun for me in terms of, like, I'm not a big research guy or anything. I'm not necessarily a world builder, but especially for a book like Two Dead that has as much to do with, since I moved away from Arkansas, most of my books are still set in a fictional Arkansas, and increasingly it's become like one of the most important ways I feel like I not only foster growth in my relationship with my hometown or my home state, but it's a way to explore corners of Arkansas or corners of Little Rock that I either was too young or too ignorant or just didn't have the interest in exploring when I actually lived here. So for a lot of that, I try to sort of give into that natural curiosity, or for a lot of settings in this book, when something intersects with my own personal memories or experiences, if it's a location or a setting that is meaningful to me, that's where I have the chance to kind of run free in my own memories and experiences and provide details that are strictly separate from the information of the script, but like this is the sort of like intangible component of collaboration, which there's this sort of open-ended contract where you both understand you're building something that couldn't precisely be anticipated by either one of you working on the book by yourselves.
Right. Can you also talk about today at UCA, you mentioned sort of having that emotional connection to Little Rock and what that brought to your experience of the script and experience of doing the book?
Oh yeah, I mean, it's interesting. Like I'm the kind of person who, I love maps, I love lists, I love examining information and memories in a visual way. And so navigating your script for Two Dead in a lot of ways, I always have this sort of like Little Rock, North Little Rock map on file in my brain. And being able to sort of overlay that map over my own memory map of life here and what I think I know about Little Rock before I was born. But there might be 30 locations throughout this book that are relevant to me personally, like in small ways that are like relatively meaningless for the purposes of the book. But that's where my task as artist is to sort of bring a sense of a sense of life to locations which otherwise could relatively seem arbitrary, but also to have enough of an understanding of the way that the topography of the city works to make it work within reason, especially when you're dealing with like car chases, when you're dealing with redlining and segregation, and literally having to segment portions of the plot so that it fits on the map in a particular way that highlights one of the major themes of the book and of the reality of Little Rock at the time.
Yeah, I did notice the Arkansas Little Rock readers in particular will find several grace notes in the book. There's up in the corner of one page, there's a scene that takes place. It's not mentioned in any of the dialogue, but it's a white little sign for Whitewater Tavern.
Right, that's Whitewater there. Yeah.
So that's fun for someone who's in Little Rock to go through and see these places. And Van, I know you've talked about having a sort of different Little Rock map in your head, a murder map, because that's what you covered, that there are locations that come to mind because they're marked by this tragedy.
Yeah, I mean, that's when I even, I have been gone for 12 years, but coming back today as we're driving around, I'll have those moments where I don't, a lot of the city I don't remember extremely well, and I was only here for 3 years. But then I'll, come around a corner and I'm back to, standing there with police cars all over and bodies in the street, and it's oh yeah, that's, that is where that person was stabbed 40 times. And it, it makes for a lot of stories, but it also, it was honestly a really hard period for me. And there's this line that's in the book that if you stay a cop long enough, this is sort of this warning that the police give. If you stay a cop long enough, you become one of three things: a cynic, a reformer, or an alcoholic. So that's a line that's said of cops, but it's also a line that's said of crime reporters. And it was something that was told to me very early on. And the ugliest thing that I ever experienced in my time was a conversation with another reporter who was a cynic. And it was a reporter who congratulated me on getting on the front page on a day when I had reported on children dying. And he was gleeful about it. And to me, that was the height of human ugliness. And so I realized, I think, fairly early on that I was not going to be an alcoholic, and I couldn't be a cynic, and I didn't, I think, have enough strength to be a reformer, so I had to find a different path.
And that became comic book writer. I think it's really a testament to the depth of the book, the spareness, and yet deep resonance to the dialogue, that this is a book that will get described and is described as a noir thriller, or be put into all those different kind of categories, but the humanity that you all bring to every character through your artistry in words and pictures is really remarkable, and I think it's a book that will reward rereading as well, to uncover the layers and the threads that are there that create such a complex story. So thank you for that.
And also, I mean, like, the inescapable thing is that it is, in fact, a noir thriller too.
Yes.
And so, like, it was a really interesting and very challenging balance at times, though it was supernatural at other times, to recognize we are making genre work, and we are concerned with talking about, more important emotional themes and personal themes. And as the work continued, it was unavoidably intersecting with larger social and political themes, but sort of understanding the limitations of hard-boiled detective as a genre, but also understanding where that gave us enough wiggle room for problematic elements and enough suspension of disbelief to let us try out things, whether they succeeded or failed in the process. Like, we found that out in real time.
Yeah, I kind of think of it as a subversion of noir, I guess. I've described it before as pacifist noir, in that it's, it has all of the trappings of noir, but it's a book chiefly concerned with the very real impact of violence and cycles of violence. And so it's this strange balance that whether we succeed or not is for others to say, but it was a hell of a ride to explore it.
I'll ask one more question, and then we'll let you go through this scene. Can you, when I refer to the books morphing over the years, it originally started out as a series, the comic book series that you were going to do. And can you talk about that transition from thinking of it as a series originally into a final book, 200 some odd pages, book length, novel length work, and also some of the choices you made to bring it to this final product today, the choices of, to do it in black and white, or, what kind of aesthetic choices you made as well to get it in the form it's in now.
So, a little context, the book, based on Nate's sketches, the book landed with an editor at Dark Horse Comics, which is traditionally a periodical, so monthly comic book, single floppy issue comic book publisher. And the plan was to publish it as a 10-issue series and then collect it after that. And actually I wrote all of it. Nate had started drawing it, and our editor left the company, and they were going through some big changes, and so they came and just gave the rights back to us. Which, these things happened, and they handled it in the best way that they possibly could have. So amid all of that, the March expanded from one book to a trilogies, and both of us had additional children come into our lives.
Yeah, our parenthood path is also the length of Two Dead, and we basically had kids at the exact same intervals. So there's this repeating theme of doubles throughout this book, and I feel like we have had doubles within doubles in our personal lives while trying to make the book too.
Yeah, what he's trying to say is we are two tired dads.
Yes. But yeah, it was.
Who love our children very much.
But yeah, while drawing March Book 3, I penciled about 40% of Two Dead way back in late 2015, early 2016. And I grew up reading serialized floppy comics. I'm not a floppy comics artist. I really found my zone with freeform graphic novels, and it gave me the chance to maximize my weirdness, especially knowing that page count does not really matter. It doesn't increase the price much. Publishers don't care. It just doesn't matter.
Aside from how much you have to draw.
Yes, right. And if you enjoy it, then you're drawing faster, and it doesn't matter anyway. So it was interesting because I feel like in my snooty graphic novelist life, I hadn't really paid attention to the structural and conceptual requirements of serialized comics narratives. And so working on Two Dead, the floppy series, it filled me with this brand new respect and perspective for a lot of, within every 20 or 22 pages, you have the overarching plot and vectors of the book, but in each issue, you have to have a series of peaks and valleys. You have to have tension at a certain point. There's a somewhat mathematical component to serializing a story of this kind.
Yeah, it's engineering. Telling a good story in 20 pages of a comic book is engineering more than it is art.
For sure. And getting to see it in script form allowed me to finally respect that for the first time. However, I was kind of relieved when
100%.
When that fell on its face. And so we let it sit for about a year or so, and then Van was like, "Hey, let's give it another go. Let's see if anybody will bite as a graphic novel." And then once people were interested, then it was like, "Oh, we're home free. We're not beholden to any structural components." But since I had already penciled almost half of it, a lot of it then was sort of leading into sort of the formal conservatism of serialized comics with the genre limitations of hard-boiled detective, while trying to make this very expansive, highly moralistic book of questions. So a lot of it was, we would go back and figure out where we needed to expand and completely cut sequences or cut entire plot points. I think we were just kind of blessed to have a bunch of little minor stumbling blocks that gave us a little bit extra time at every turn to reconsider what we were doing.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know how many writers we have out there, but I'm a big believer in incrementalism and progress, and it's getting to be good at something is all about repetitions, right? So, this book has, in some form, been meandering along in my head for more than a decade. So to have the chance to rewrite it as a graphic novel, well, the stuff had been written, 3+ years prior. So I had grown a good bit as a writer in those 3 years. I mean, I've been working steadily, and I hope getting better and better. And so then I go back and look at, 3-year-old writing, and there's a component of it for me that's just like, oh man, this is not good. so I also just really, as serious of topics as the book tackles, I really appreciate the chance to go and, I mean, frankly, just make it better than it had been in its first incarnation. And part of that, and something we talk about a lot, is that in that time period, especially 2014, 2015 to today, the world has changed, and not in the fact that all of a sudden there's racism and racial violence and police brutality, but that there is front and center awareness and conversation about those topics in a way that there had not been prior to that. So in this very strange way, in real time as we're working on this book, these topics just become more and more relevant and more in front of us. And so we were having this constant dialogue of making sure that we were treating these elements very seriously, to making sure that we were not losing that contemporary context and bringing it into the book, even while keeping it set in the 1940s.
And I guess the complicating element there goes back to the thriller component, which always has like a hint of exploitation involved, in recognizing that you are making a certain kind of story, and there are these sort of like, you have to recognize that there are components within the book that don't really jive with each other, but also understanding a contract between a creator and a reader or a viewer, and people's ability, not only their ability, but the tendency for each of us as readers to project where we are in the world and what's going on in our world around us with anything that we are watching or reading, and just sort of like trying to trust that will carry itself across. I don't know, it was a precarious balance, but we chose this excerpt partially for that reason. It has a lot of thematic elements that are central to the book itself. Yeah, like there are a lot of, especially, for the briefest possible setup, what was really important to me, like the present day scenes in the book take place in 1946, 1947, and historically, like socially speaking, where you have not only the war economy, but the shifting social politics of World War II, which resulted in a lot of economic empowerment for American women and also for Black Americans across the board within the war economy and within service in the war. And then there was sort of a resegregation, a new strong push back into the old box that no longer fit immediately, late 1945, 1946, that's actually leading into a housing bubble crisis, and a lot of like worker strikes in 1947, but a lot of the re-stratifying and resegregation, a lot of re-implementing old tools of oppression in 1946 brought so much tension up to the surface that so many of the seeds of the late 1950s to late 1960s were planted in the years immediately following World War II, which is, I think, a crucial component of World War II history, labor history, and civil rights history that are very underserved. So yeah, this sequence here starts in 1946, and then you'll see there's a stylistic shift from flat black and white line art. This is my Lego man. Just shows that it's black, white line art, to sort of a wash style that you may recognize from March, that sort of takes us back to the 1920s. So we also chose that because this sort of this butts us up against the unavoidable, somewhat problematic elements that are brought about by that intersection of history, thematic interest, and also the genre itself.
Yeah, and so the scene that we're going to look at, this takes place midway through the book, and two brothers that were based on, they're kind of a composite of real-life characters that I didn't have a lot of historical information for, so there's a lot of creation that went into them, but a lot of historical elements that went into who these characters became. But two African-American brothers, Jacob and Esau Davis, and one of them is a leader of the militia police force for the African-American part of the city. That's Jacob. Esau, the older brother, is involved with organized crime. And one aspect of history that I found very compelling was that one of the kind of least segregated parts of society in Little Rock at the time was within the underworld. And so, you see sort of the struggle of one, each of them trying to do right in their own way, but involved on either side of the law, but also rehashing old family pain.
And since
this is your script, and you know it more intimately than me, like, I'm telling you, you take the lead really on the script components in terms of like your internal thought processes. And
I'm on it.
So here we go, Billy on the street. Okay, so here we are. We've got Esau returning from another chapter in the book, a little ragged for the wear, arriving at the house, at this house, giving a knock on the door.
Yeah, so these are that's Esau on the left, Jacob on the right. So this is Esau coming to Jacob's house.
Right. And Jacob's like, who is it? Oh, Esau. And these are my two favorite characters in the book. This is like the heavy Shakespearean family dynamic within the book. So Esau wasn't sure if he still lived here. Lifetime of baggage. Dad willed it to me. What was I going to do? Sell it? Of course, you did that with the shop. Could you spare me the lecture just this once? It's been a bad night, and I could really use a place to sleep.
So here you see the script and this is for those who haven't seen a comic book script, it's a really boring document that does not, you see the finished art and it's like, did that come from this pile of text? But yeah, so this is what a script looks like. You see it breaks down by page and then by panel, so you're cutting through a part of it. So this is what you're going to see on the next page, going from you can read what's up there.
Well, importantly, as you were saying earlier today, this is where, number one, nobody ever sees the comic script. So like there's no one way to do it anymore. Nobody cares inside the industry. Some people send just straight prose. Some people break it down so finely. So as you were saying earlier, you're essentially writing a letter to me.
Yeah, this is all about me communicating the first stage of storytelling to Nate.
Yeah. So here we are as we begin the adaptation of that particular page of script. They're inside, placed to sleep, their childhood bedrooms, back in their good old twin beds from their childhoods, sitting in darkness. Jesus, just go ahead and say it already. Say what? Say that I screwed up again. Tell me that I'm a failure, that I only have myself to blame. I can hear you sitting there thinking it. So just let it out like you always do. You show up in the middle of the night, dripping blood on my doorstep, in need of a favor, and now you're mad at me? That's rich. Oh, there it is. Are you telling me none of this is your fault? You were just minding your own business and the world dumped on you for no good reason? Yeah, that's what I thought. Now keep in mind, what I really like about this fraternal dynamic is that sort of like the A student, oddly, is the younger brother. And so there's this really weird, I think there's this jilted, mixed up, this upside down birth order situation happening that's like just under the surface.
Right, which of course I made very literal in their names.
Yes, of course. You know what? I did screw up. But that doesn't make you better than me, little brother. I do what I do to make a buck, sure. But I do it to do the right thing. And I never hurt anyone. Not anyone who didn't deserve it.
So now back to the script, and so you'll see, trying to keep the flow of conversation is sort of the key. It's separating out into individual beats. A comic book is not like a film. It's not a flow of time. It's staccato moments, and so you really have to pick. That Jacob looks away, hurt by what he hears. Esau keeps drilling him. It's in that one moment. What is each character doing? And picking the right moments, that last word to deliver, and then even having, panel 5, they lay there in silence, nothing resolved, both awake, and having no dialogue. It's a very important thing when you start to work with comics, realizing that even the absence of text becomes part of the storytelling.
Yeah, comics are a linear reading experience, but they are also time travel. Like the reader has complete control over the flow of time and information, and we are able to guide and manipulate you as creators, but part of it is being more assertive by asserting silence. This is the jazz component of comics, where it's about what's in between the notes. Okay, now I'm going to go forward, then I'm going to go back to this line of script, because I think this is a really good entry point into our real-time considerations of the way our work looks after it's already on the page, drawn and lettered. Okay. You've been so damn smug. Okay, Esau now goes on the offensive. You've been so damn smug, so superior your whole life. You killed some Krauts in the army. Hooray, you're a hero. And now you march around with your little police force. But I know how your department got started. You don't know jack. The white cops pay your bills, keep you on the streets. It's the army all over again, marching to the white man's orders. So headed back, this is one of these spots where actually the art basically remained the same, but I lettered from this script originally, and it wasn't until we're like 3/4 of the way through the book, and I'm still drawing, but we realized there were fine tunings that not only like altered the general tone of the book and the characterization, but also resulted in confronting our own kind of implicit bias in our worldview and our framework just by putting things on the page. So in particular, so like here, there were a couple of moments, because there's this tension between like the black police force, which is essentially a militia, who do not even have uniforms. So a lot of folks came back from World War II and they're using their army uniforms as a system to remain quasi-consistent with each other. But the level of like, shame and resentment matched with a sense of duty and pride was really on display here. So striking the right tone even like caught us when 3/4 of the way through the book we're now analyzing stuff where when Esau's really trying to dig, we're also trying to be wary of whatever his level of, or like where he's intersecting with the power dynamics in terms of race, in terms of white supremacy, in terms of the social order of Little Rock that they're trying to make their way through. So here, I think I pushed back at first on this little like Esau's line, the real cops, the white ones, they pay your bills, keep you on the street, it's the army all over again. But to me, it didn't seem consistent with Esau to, like it's a little thing, but I know he's trying to cut down his brother and dig at him a little bit, but in my mind, by that time, I had built a relationship with Esau, and Esau had grown for you too. And I was like, Esau doesn't feel like the cops are the real cops. And like, it's false for him to actually take a white supremacist, take a racist idea behind the power structure of law enforcement here. No matter how much his brother's getting under his skin, he just wouldn't say that.
Yeah, he would never vouch for that. Yeah, that's the power of collaboration. I think the importance of recognizing that, we're two white men, both of a relative amount of privilege, delving into a world that is not our own, and you have to handle that with great care.
For sure. Particularly, there are ways in which I've lucked out with other comics projects where I'm telling someone else's story. I've been tasked by them to be there, to see through their eyes, and to be their voice. And so diving back, this is grounded in history, diving into fiction, that is not the same wiggle room, and it shouldn't be. So here we are. It's the army all over again, marching to the white man's orders. So here it's just the white cops pay your bills, keep you on the street. I may not always pick the best direction, but at least I choose my own course. Sit in silence, a gulp, and then
So this is cutting into that,
you keep on going. I'm going to just give us the visual.
yeah, that 15, 20-year time period earlier, exact same shot, and it's the brothers, younger, and this, you realize this is their childhood bedroom, and they're rehashing the same dynamic that's been going.
And at the same time, there's also like, I've got like little tiny like Alan Moore micro details on like a little like whatever popcorn trail I'm sprinkling here, like the two lamps and the reflection on the table from the peeled curtain is supposed to resemble an owl's head or an owl's face just enough that the graphic symbol of an owl's head is used throughout the underworld for a lot of their speakeasy systems in this book. And so when turning up the temperature in terms of like conspiratorial thinking and paranoia throughout the book, these are the things that no one notices and that sometimes I forget that I did. And then when I notice them, I'm like, you go, Nate. So you're like, Esau. So I'm just standing up now. That's what's happening. Just like, Esau.
Stretch those legs.
Esau. What is it? Do you hear that? There was something outside. A crash or something. He turns on the light. It's just a nightmare, Jacob. And since Dad's gone, I'm in charge. So I say go back to, get the hell out here. We know you're in there. He turns the light. Jacob immediately turns the light back off. Big brother gets on the protective tip. What is it? They're out in the hall. Just stay behind me. They make their way to the front room. If you don't come out, we'll just burn the house down around you. Why would they come for us? What did we do? They make their way to the window. Not us. They're in front of Teddy's house. And we can see here just the faintest line work, which shows multiple members of the clan in costume. We see a shotgun. We see at least 3 torches. And that's all we can see right now. We see their next door neighbor. Well, what do you want? I didn't do nothing, I swear. He gets struck in the stomach. Shut up, you goddamn thief. I'm not. The white supremacist terrorists drag him away from his front porch. Gotta pay. Okay, let's jump forward and then back, because I want to just make sure we're on the same page here. We're switching back to Esau and Jacob.
Yeah, so what you see here is the brothers snapping into action, and this was a scene that, I mean, we, as much as the brothers wrestle in this scene, we wrestled with, not out of any disagreement, but out of, I think, an abundance of care and of concern with depicting these horrific events there is absolutely a place in using fiction to horrify people, and to not hiding from that, but also, there's a great responsibility that comes with that.
And particularly where being so accustomed to depictions of physical violence visually through the comic book medium, at first through March, and I feel like it was really honed with this, like because this is such genre work. My work on March resensitized me and made me sort of deprogrammed me from everything I had grown up reading and learning about depictions of violence visually, and sort of set the stage to always exercise a particular kind of mindfulness. But most importantly, how far a very minimal depiction of such kinds of terror, like it goes so far. And most of our conversations were like, the reader gets it. They get it.
Pulling back and showing less and less, keeping the focus on the brothers.
Dad hides his gun in his sock drawer. Esau, you can't. And then outside of the window, beg. I want to hear you beg. And I'm not going to sit here and watch this happen. Esau storms off towards their dad's bedroom to get the gun. No, Jacob tackles him. Outside the window. No, I'm no dog. I'm a man. Jacob, let go of me. I'm a man. No, they'll kill you. I'm a man. I won't let you go. I won't. And then we're going to move forward. I'm moving back to the script. So this is a really fine point here, but when we were talking about, the car ride earlier, so much of storytelling is managing, controlling, and manipulating tension. And so as the tension's rising in the scene, it's little details like, as you see in like caption 12, or word balloon 12, Teddy from Outside Loud, recognizing that even beginning to say the word man in that final disarms some of the tension, and that's not really earned in that moment, that it's more horrifying to not give him the benefit of beginning the word. And a lot of that, I think, this is where the difference between doing a serialized floppy comic, and some of this is like, without being too snooty graphic novelist about it, this is where you have to increase that level of trust with the reader to just get it at a certain level without feeding them too much, too many pebbles of obviousness.
Yeah, absolutely. And even go back to the, the way.
Oh, next one.
Oh no, the previous one. The way that. Oh, one more forward from here.
Okay.
There we go. Leave it there. Nate's lettering and the way that the lettering becomes a character within this interaction, and the way that it builds on the tension, I think is, that's mastery of the form in evidence.
It only happens in comics. That's why comics are magic. And my apologies for saying that in a somewhat silly voice. I actually didn't mean for y'all to laugh. Sorry. Okay, so now we move back to 1946. It is now dawn. Jacob wakes up. He's got his pajamas on. Esau is gone. The door is open. He's looking out into a fresh morning. Esau's left a note on the table. He's here at the same open window where the flashback occurred in the 1920s. He walks away, puts the note back on the table. Jacob, thanks for the bed. Sorry we fought. Again. I have to see a man this morning and I might not be back. If not, let it lie. I got what I earned. Esau. P.S. Dad's gone. You should move into his room. It's your house now. He walks out on the porch. It's a new day. We see the shadow of their neighboring oak tree. And then Jacob cries. Yeah, so there's that scene, and now Nate cries too. Yeah, alrighty. Fun times.
Thank you all
Okay.
so much. It's really striking. And now we'll have some time for questions. Yes, if you could, can you get up to the microphone there, or can somebody bring?
I have a question for Van. As a reporter, would you still have asked about the breakfast muffins if the car had come through the house and killed the woman's child?
I would not have.
And so, no pun intended, but where do you draw the line?
Context is everything. In a situation, I had to go and interview people after they lost children, and it's just an incredibly hard thing to do. And I hated that aspect of the job, but I also understood the importance of doing it in that I had doors slammed in my face. But I also had people who cherished the opportunity to share stories about the loved ones that they lost and wanted that opportunity and would not have had it if I had not gone and talked to them. And, you know, when you're dealing with someone who is experiencing extreme grief, I'm a believer in letting them set the terms. You know, there is a magnitude of difference between losing a child and losing a wall.
It's y'all's time. Somebody's got a question. That's right.
So there's a lot of talk about, specifically I'm sure there's a lot of us who are members on Reddit and things like that who talk about writing for people who aren't like ourselves, say a man writing for a woman or a person who is Caucasian writing for an African American. How did you make that? It seems like you're very, very sensitive to the topic and you do a very good job of it. How did you make that gamble work for you, and what was like the procedure that you went through to be able to make that come to life the way it has?
I think from being a reporter, the thing that you learn about writing is just that research is everything. You know, you can write knowledgeably about things when you are knowledgeable about them, but it also takes the intention of seeking out other people's opinions, of having conversations, having early readers, having people who you trust to tell you that you are doing a bad job, and then showing you the way to be better. I mean, I've been very, very, very fortunate to have very honest friends, and you know, through nonfiction and fiction combined, I've had, you know, millions of words in print, and a lot of them are not that good. You know, I've been writing professionally for 20 years, and I feel like I'm kind of starting to figure out what I'm doing. But it has helped to have people who, you know, can really give me honest feedback. But I think this is true of being a writer, but I also think that this is true of being a human, that there's a ton of value to be had in actively engaging with people and communities that are outside of what's the norm for you.
My brief answer to that generally has to do with, I feel like this first emerged as a priority for me when it was Swallow Me Whole in the mid-2000s, and it's you know, a coming-of-age story that is about a quest for dignity in the face of change, but it has to do with emerging symptoms of different mental illnesses, changing sensory perceptions, and my career during that time was also working with adults with disabilities and dual diagnoses, or dual diagnosis, and trying to draw a very clear line so that I wasn't being directly inspired by and thus exploiting the lives of the people who I worked with, but also trusting myself to at least theoretically be able to tell the stories of people whose experiences were far outside of my own at times. And the most concrete way I can describe it is that for me it works best when I put myself in the position of really trying to see, hear, and touch, really trying to funnel these sensory experiences of the characters who I'm writing and drawing. So much so, getting so close to that character and their direct sensory experiences that the reader is beyond a place of judgment about, they're beyond a place of feeling like it's their job to arrive at a conclusion about the character, or arrive at a conclusion about my intention, so that they're having an actual experience with the character. I mean, in essence, that's like setting you up to foster empathy with the character. But for me, concretely, it has to do with the sights and sounds that are around them. In the bigger picture, I feel like this was a longer path that had to do with going from that sort of exercise or that revelation in Swallow Me Whole to being chosen by someone to be their voice, to tell not only their experiences, but the experiences of a mass movement of millions of people, mostly through one person's eyes and using their words. So like when I was doing my job correctly with March, most of the time I was actually being empowered by the person who experienced it to be his voice, which was a really weird responsibility to have, but that was the responsibility of telling the story. And even though that's an extreme example, recognizing that, going back to the contract between reader and creator, that like you just have to, creators have to give readers a little more credit and faith that, you know, like creators have to, like part of the contract is like, we're leading you somewhere. Trust that we're going to deliver you there safely. But on the other end, yeah, it's a little bit of an act of faith, but also a recognition that you're going to fail at it sometimes. And I think in particular, like where you're talking about, or not where you, but where one is addressing these issues of anxiety and insecurity about it, I think it really goes into like the fragility of being afraid to be criticized for what you're doing. But what you're doing is you are opening yourself up to criticism. So like, it's possible you won't pull it off. I feel like there's sort of an oversensitivity to problematic components in storytelling, and I think it's a little bit grayer of an area. But I think a lot of it is just like when you bomb at something, being able to own up to it, or recognize that it's not just like you succeeded or failed, but like there are components that you didn't do well and others that you did. So I think a lot of it is internal. A lot of it is just sheer anxiety about not, kicking it at 100 when you attempt it.
Yeah, I mean I think the best storytelling comes when you take your innermost emotional true self and then put it on a piece of paper and offer it to the world for judgment. But then that's also, that's incredibly hard to do that because not everyone's going to love it.
And sometimes we don't love it either.
Yeah. Very true.
One more question, and then they'll be out in the lobby signing.
Okay. My background with comics, discounting the Sunday funnies. 60 years ago, I would wait for the next issue of Archie, Jughead, Veronica, and Betty.
Still going strong.
Are they really?
Yeah.
And I got to 3rd grade, and Nancy Drew took me away from all that. But a few years ago, I picked up a copy of Swallow Me Whole at my daughter's and started reading. And I said, Jen, this isn't funny. This is not, there are no jokes in here. So I was much better prepared when March came along. And my question for each of you is, after you introduced yourselves and told about the decade that went into this book that I'm very eager to read, is what's next for each of you?
Sure. Well, right now I'm wrapping up work on returning to nonfiction briefly. I'm actually not a nonfiction comics person, really, but I'm finishing a book called Tornado Children. It's a little bit shorter. It's essentially a combination of essay and memoir that's basically about raising kids in an era of sustained, necessary protest. And once I finish that, then my next thing is I'm working with a horror writer, this guy Steve Niles. He did the comic and movie 30 Days of Night, if you've seen it or read it, and some other horror stuff. But he also comes from a punk background in DC, and I'm drawing a memoir of his life growing up in the DC punk scene, but how it also relates just to messed up family dynamics, addiction, mental health issues, and developing a concept of family that fits your life in and what it needs, particularly when there is a lack of health in your own family's relationship with you. So that's going to be 2020 for me.
Let's see. I'm writing some stuff for DC Comics. Again, after a couple years of not doing the corporate superhero stuff. It's fun though. I wrote a story about Clark Kent being a reporter, which is great. So
You just wrote a Wonder Woman story too, didn't you?
yeah, I did Wonder Woman. Got another Flash story coming up. I've been adapting the James Bond novels into graphic novels. So Casino Royale is out already. Live and Let Die comes out next month. And then let's see, I have been developing a TV show, and then I have a novel that I wrote that might be the next thing that I have out that is called Godfall. It is about a 3-mile tall humanoid alien that falls in western Nebraska but is dead with a giant spear stabbed through its chest. And the story is about the the sheriff of the small town that's in the shadow of this dead giant alien. So yeah, fun times.
Let's give Van and Nate the big round of applause.